fans, Tamashi here. Recently I covered both my top 10 best and worst gym leaders, and since I'm on a roll with these top 10 lists, I figured this week I'm gonna go ahead and do my top 10 rivals.
Rivals and their roles have changed a lot as Pokemon has evolved as a series. In the beginning they were antagonistic, and over the years they've progressively become more and more like allies. But regardless of how far along on this scale each rival lies, they're all still quite unique. With there being only 6 gens, it comes out to a pretty even exact 10 for the number of rivals actually in the main series games. So this list will be ranking not only the top 10 best rivals, but also the top 10 worst. Let's start counting down those rivals, starting from the worst and making our way towards the best. Number 10, Calem and Serena. Calem and Serena share a slot, because they're essentially the exact same character. In the past, gender rivals would have different personalities, depending on which gender you chose to play as. But aside from minor differences in speech, the two say the exact same things at the exact same time, and essentially have the same personality. Both Calem and Serena are the kid of 2 well-known battlers, and for this reason, they and everyone else around them have high expectations for their skill in battle. And they're actually the first characters in a long time to be self-proclaimed rivals. The problem with these two, though, is that they rarely show up in scenes alone. There are a metric butt-ton of characters in X and Y, and with so many to share screen time with, the only lines Calem and Serena really get to speak are expository, which doesn't leave them with much room to be developed at all. And unlike past rivals, these two are always trailing behind the player and moping when they lose. It really doesn't feel like a rivalry when you're constantly leaving them in the dust. The only real growth either of these two experience is realizing that they don't have to try to be different from everyone else to be special, because they're unique for just being themselves. But this especially rings hollow when they basically get lost in an enormous cast of characters, and it's hard to even remember anything about them by the end of the game. Maybe they should have tried harder to actually make these two unique, rather than excusing it with dialogue. Number 9, Hugh. I have already ranted in a couple different videos about how dumb and nonsensical Hugh's character motivations are, so I'll try not to be too redundant here. The big issue with Hugh is that he's oddly central to the main story of Black and White 2. The game is almost more about him than it is about Team Plasma, since the enemy team really doesn't have a lot to do now that they've revealed their motives and lost all their depth. And since Hugh's story is such a big part of the narrative, it really ends up dragging the whole game down with how sloppy it all is. His whole deal is that he's obsessed with finding his sister's Purloin and rescuing it. This wouldn't be a problem if we knew his sister, or if she had more than one line in the entire game, or if she even had a name or unique sprite. But she doesn't. She just appears once at the beginning of the game and doesn't even mention the Purloin. So it's really difficult to care about Hugh's motives when they're centered around getting back something that's supposed to be important to someone that we don't know and can't connect with. There's no stakes, so it's hard to get invested. Hugh himself isn't even that bad, and with just a few minor tweaks, the story could have been way improved. For example, if the Purloin was actually his and he was trying to get back his own Pokemon, or even if we got to hear from the sister herself about why this Purloin matters to her, and maybe why she's not going after it herself. Hugh is passionate and headstrong, and would have been really memorable and great if he wasn't also completely inconsistent, and if there's more to him than just this one ill-conceived plot thread. But unfortunately things didn't work out so well, and he ends up bringing down the quality of my all-time favorite Pokemon game and contributing to one of the worst stories in Pokemon history. Number 8, Shauna, Tierno, and Trevor. These three share a slot because much like Serena and Calem, their characters suffer quite a bit from an overcrowded and undeveloped cast, and the only reason they count as rivals at all is because you do have to battle them repeatedly. I do like the idea behind the three, and the fact that they were trying to provide some rivals that tied into some of the other major aspects of the franchise, like filling the decks for example, is pretty neat, but it just wasn't done very well. Trevor gets very few lines, and since he's shy, most of them involve talking about other characters and not himself. His thing is that he tries to fill his decks faster than you, but again, he's always lagging behind, so it doesn't feel like a real rivalry. There's no challenge, he's just there to stroke your ego. Tierno would have been neat if maybe his dancing was tied into the game mechanically in any way, but it never goes anywhere. He just likes to dance and likes to talk about dancing and gives you some TMs and that's it. Again, he has very few lines and we don't get to know him much. Shauna is the only one that's even a little memorable, because she shows up often enough to be fleshed out some, and she actually gets to show up solo now and again, without the other two cutting into her screen time. According to Masuda, she's written intentionally to sound like she has romantic interest in the player, and her lines are the same regardless of which gender you pick. In a way, that's pretty interesting, because aside from Yancy and Curtis in Black and White 2, Pokemon has never attempted anything like that before. But personally, I really don't enjoy being hit on when I'm trying to play Pokemon, so Yancy and Curtis always just annoyed me. Shauna, at the very least, isn't quite as forward, so you could read her actions as just very affectionate friendship, which is how I chose to look at it. It was an interesting experiment to have such a large cast of friends to make you feel like you're traveling with a group, but I would have preferred fewer characters with a lot more depth than how these three ended up. Number 7, May. I'm not putting May and Brendan in the same slot, because they're actually very different characters. May in the original Ruby and Sapphire was the first female rival, and though she was friendly and likable, she was also unfortunately more or less a stereotype. She was less competitive, and not interested in battling so much as she just wanted to collect Pokemon and shop for dolls. She was ditzy and airheaded, and just wanted to make friends with everyone and every Pokemon. Not that there's anything wrong with these qualities, it just makes her kind of uninteresting to me, because I've seen this kind of character before. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, there's at least a little more variation to her character. She has more dialogue, and her character animations make her pretty adorable. But since her general traits stayed the same, it didn't feel like she had as much of an arc as Brendan, who I'll get to later. She started out wanting to be your friend, and by the end of the game, she was your friend. There was no change in her character, and she remained pretty static. There really aren't any surprises with her. ORAS May is much more palatable than OG May, but ultimately not a super interesting character to me. Number 6, Wally. Wally definitely marked a big shift in the way rivals were designed. For the first time ever, we were introduced to a fledgling trainer, and we had to show them how to catch a Pokemon. It was an interesting twist. Wally was never meant to be a full-on rival, but instead more of a pupil for the player to mentor. Interesting for this kind of setup, Wally was still generally ahead of you, and got to new places quicker than the player, and would even challenge the player to see how he's improved. This was meant to show a growth in Wally's ability. Rather than showing him constantly struggling to catch up with the player, he made strides on his own, even becoming independent from his family and traveling without them. In the original games, I feel like this didn't fully come across. Wally was set up as being frail and sickly, but I feel like he didn't have a lot of personality, so it wasn't as satisfying to see him grow. In ORAS, they fixed this issue. Thanks to the addition of character animations on the overworld, we got to see him show a range of emotions, and his dialogue was changed to show how he slowly grew more confident over time. He didn't feel nearly as flat, and because of this, I think he worked much better overall. We got to see him progress through the game, as well as become more self-assured. I also really enjoyed getting to know Wally's family, and seeing his uncle worry over him. Overall, Wally is a unique type of rival, and I enjoyed helping him grow. Coming in at number 5, Thud. It's Barry. Barry is the only actual rival in Diamond and Pearl. Lucas and Dawn don't ever battle you. They only battle alongside you, and that really seems to be the distinguishing point between rival and trainer characters. I'm not really sure how Barry got his name, aside from his anime counterpart. His default names in the games are either Diamond or Pearl depending on which version you're playing, and his placeholder name in the code is actually Cedric, but his official name nevertheless seems to be Barry, so that's what we'll go with. Barry is one of the more memorable parts of the Sinnoh games, and to me stands out as a positive. Barry has such a zest for life, and so much enthusiasm. He's really refreshing in a game with, overall, a more muted and mellow cast of characters. Suitable to have an impatient rival in by far the slowest Pokemon game, huh? I feel like half the time he's channeling my restlessness when he goes rocketing around. I like that he's a friend of the player, but regardless remains ahead of them for the entire game simply because he's got a firecracker up his butt and he just can't slow down for 5 seconds. I'm not sure I would have the energy to deal with him if I knew him in real life, but he's got a lot of personality and he's fun to interact with throughout the games. So, counting down, Barry comes in at 7, 6, 5, bah, who has time to count? Number 4, Blue. The one and only original rival, Blue set the precedent for all rivals to come. And though many things about the Gen 1 games didn't age very well, surprisingly, he holds up. Though he was really little more than an arrogant, snobby, jerk-faced brat, the fact that he was an antagonistic rival actually makes him unique when compared to rivals today. Blue was always one step ahead of the player no matter what, and even when he didn't show up to rub his progress in your face, his name was on every gym sign before yours. He didn't seem to care much at all about Team Rocket. He'd show up right in the middle of a hostage situation to kick your butt and remind you that his poo don't stink, culminating in him becoming the Pokemon champion before even you do. No matter how many times you beat him, it still felt like he was better than you, and he knew it too. Blue was a challenging battle every time, with some of the most OP and rare Pokemon in Kanto on his team, and always over-leveled for where you were in the game. When rivals today want to stroke your ego and make you feel good about yourself, Blue was always tearing you down, and is really the only rival that felt like a real rival. And for that, though perhaps a little one-dimensional, Blue stands out as one of the most memorable and satisfying rivals in the series. Number 3, Brendan. Brendan may have very similar roles as rivals, but because Brendan starts out with a very different outlook than he has by the end of the story, at least in ORAS, his rivalry and friendship with the player feels the most dynamic of all the rivals in Pokemon, and really sets him apart from his female counterpart. Much like May, Brendan begins the game as a bit of a stereotype. I'm not trying to criticize the game when I say that Brendan was slightly misogynistic, because in this case it's simply a character trait, and not indicative of the quality of the game itself or the values of its creators. And honestly, it's not even a critique of Brendan as a character. I'm glad he has this trait. because his growth from that place is what makes him so great, and also makes him feel like a real person. For a lot of girls, Ruby and Sapphire were the first games we could participate in that let us be ourselves, since Crystal was the third version and not as many kids get to play those. For me, it wasn't unusual that boys would underestimate me, or assume I didn't play games based on my gender, and I had lots of friends in elementary school that flat out wouldn't even let me play their consoles on playdates because I was a girl. So Brendan's remark about assuming the gym leader's kid would be a guy actually made him feel more real than if he had ignored the player's gender altogether. He was a very fitting rival for being able to play as a girl for the first time in a Pokemon game, and it really got me fired up and ready to prove him wrong, in a similar vein to Blue Steering and Snobbery in the first Pokemon games. For this reason, I've always liked Brendan as a rival, but his updates in ORAS took him above and beyond. Not only as a rival, but as a person. In ORAS, not only does he grow to respect the player, but he actually grows to really value the player as a friend, which shows how much he's learned and changed as a person throughout the game. This gives his character a real arc, in the way it never had in the original games, and also that May doesn't really have either. And little things here and there add even more to his personality than you can see in the original games. For example, it's not just May that likes to shop for dolls this time around. He wasn't mean-spirited, just ignorant. And when he gets to know you, he grows out of it and becomes a better person from the experience of having you as a friend. This is why I don't hold grudges. Everyone says ignorant things and has biases, even if they don't realize it. And everyone is capable of learning and changing their perspective. Brendan is just another reminder that we all have room to grow. Number 2, Sharon and Bianca. I've talked about Bianca, and I've talked about Sharon, but now I get to talk about them together. These two really only work as parallels of one another, but because they're both there, they work phenomenally well. Going along with the theme of black and white, Sharon and Bianca each represent one concept, with Bianca representing truth and Sharon representing ideals. Bianca's very honest with herself, and introspective enough to realize what she's capable of versus what she isn't. Meanwhile, Sharon is idealistic, and in spite of losing to the player repeatedly, continues to dream of one day besting them. Ultimately, this leads them down very different paths in life, but it still leads them both to happiness. One of my favorite things about each of them too is that they're the player's friends from the very beginning of the game. They're a step between Barry and the Gen 6 gang, and I feel like they strike the perfect balance. The fact that they're a group of friends makes the Unova region feel like home, and give you a sense of community there. But the fact that there aren't a million of them means that they each get to be fully developed characters with hopes, dreams, families, and aspirations. Seeing where they end up in Black and White 2 makes them all the more satisfying, in much the same way that having Blue become a gym leader in Gen 2 did. They get a resolution and continue to guide the player. Rather than comrades, they're now mentors and teach the player, helping them along with their journey, which shows how much they've matured since the first game. If you'd like to hear more about each one in depth, they've both appeared in previous top 10 lists, and I'll link them both in the end slate. But ultimately, it's their contrast to each other that makes them whole, and they balance each other out perfectly. And the number one rival is Silver. Of every rival in every Pokemon game, Silver hands down shows the most development and grows the most over the course of his story. Following in Blue's footsteps, Silver is far from friendly, but he takes it a step further and steals the Pokemon from the lab at the beginning of the game, making him an actual criminal. Couple this with his training philosophy, that weak Pokemon are worthless and a waste of time, perceiving anyone with even a little empathy toward Pokemon as weak, and he comes across as a really bad dude. Throughout the game, his goal isn't to be better than you, or even collect badges faster than you. His goal is to take out Team Rocket before you do, and become the most powerful trainer in the world. In the original games, his motivation was never disclosed, but in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as part of the Celebi event, it's revealed that he's actually Giovanni's son, and his hatred of Team Rocket stems from Giovanni abandoning him to go into hiding when Team Rocket failed. Silver isn't just flat out an evil person though. Throughout the game, as he interacts with the player and other characters, he slowly learns that to be the most powerful trainer, he needs to earn the love and respect of his Pokemon. It's hard for him to accept this at first, and he dismisses those who try and teach him as weak. But the more he trains with his Pokemon, the more he learns to love them, and that he doesn't want to be the strongest trainer in the world, but instead the greatest trainer. What I really love about his growth is that it's actually reinforced by the mechanics. He has a Golbat in his party from the second time you battle him on. It's not until you finally battle him for the 7th time at the Indigo Plateau that his Golbat has actually evolved into a Crobat, an evolution that can only occur if a Pokemon's friendship level with its trainer is high. Additionally, in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, his starter begins to follow him around the same way the player's Pokemon do. By opening his heart, he evolves, not just his Crobat, and seeing him become a better person is more satisfying than even beating Bratty Blue. So there you have it, my top 10 best and worst rivals. Let me know what your favorites and least favorites are in the comments below. If you want to see the top 10 list where I talk about Sharon, you can click here. Or if you want to see the top 10 list where I talk about Bianca, you can click here. As always, don't forget to click here to subscribe for more Pokemon videos twice a week. See ya!